From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Anne-Marie Horder, I'm Joe Matthew.
Democrats own the off-year election in Virginia, Kentucky, and a ballot vote in Ohio. Despite President Biden's dismal poll numbers, we'll look at what it means for 2024.
From the midterms to last night, from California to Kansas, Ohio to Virginia, the voters said, look, the government should not be telling a woman what to do with her body.
And looking ahead to 2024, 5 Republican presidential candidates set to take the stage tonight for the third debate of the cycle, while former President Trump sits it out again.
And the former president is paying close attention to his daughter Ivanka's testimony in the civil fraud case brought against him in New York. And we'll have more on that with Ty Cobb, who worked for the former president in the White House as an attorney. Joe, welcome back.
Good to see you.
What a really interesting election.
That's
overnight,
for sure.
Especially what happened in Virginia. Glenn Youngkin set the bar very high for himself, though. He wanted to turn the entire state red. He didn't do that. So today it's a great morning for Democrats, but there's some nuance to it, of course.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There were a lot of folks talking about that being the trail he might take to the presidential campaign. Maybe he's a late arrival to go up against Donald Trump or maybe Joe Biden, but it's not feeling like that today, at least with regard to Virginia. We're going to talk about some of these states, but let's listen to the Virginia governor reflecting on his party's poor showing yesterday.
I'm a little disappointed, to be clear. And I think that that's just a natural reality. But we've stepped back and we recognize that, boy, this was a razor thin set of decisions that were made on both sides of a number of these races. And I think it underpins the fact that Virginia is clearly a state that has historically moved back and forth from control of one party in the legislature to control the others, the governor's races, with very, very thin margins.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsen and Christian Hall. Thank you both so much for joining us. Christian, let's start with you. You were covering deeply these races in Virginia. When you look at some of the numbers, actually, Republicans did pretty well, but it was razor thin in some of these big Biden districts. But Glenn Youngkin fell short of, as Joe was saying, this path many donors wanted him to potentially take. If he had a great night last night, he could have maybe stepped in for 2024. What does this mean for him?
I think that, the immediate reaction is that this notion that Glenn Youngkin was going to swoop in and save the day in 2024 probably won't happen. I mean, the results of the election weren't in his favor, but the door is still open in 2028. Going into the election, strategists, journalists would agree that, Virginia is a bluish state. And as he mentioned in that video, the margins were razor thin. I was talking to a Republican strategist, and he said, look, this isn't ideal for him, but the momentum that Youngkin built before the election hasn't gone anywhere. It's still there. Now he has an opportunity to shoot down some of the Democratic legislation that's going to come through assembly that is controlled by Democrats in the Senate and the House. So it's not over for Glenn Youngkin. 2028 is more likely something that he's going to look towards now. But 2024, I don't foresee him entering in at this late in the game.
He was open about the fact that if they took the legislature, Saleha, that a 15-week abortion ban would be something pursued by the new Republican majority. We also saw an important vote on abortion in Ohio last night. They're consistent in their outcome. How much of that had to do with the result in Virginia?
Joe, a lot of that had to do with the fact that Republicans are not seeing the wave materialize that's been predicted time and time again. Republicans are seeing a little bit of a reckoning with abortion policy and politics coming through, social and cultural issues coming through more aggressively than they expected. So there has been a change in the way the Democrats are billing the elections, of what they saw yesterday, what they see ahead, despite the fact that the president that is running again is not the pick for most voters, at least today, based on polls polling today. But abortion policies have really resonated with independents and with Republicans, particularly suburban moms.
Isn't it such a mismatch, though? Polls, time and time again, say the economy rates number one. Everyone is concerned about inflation. But yet at the end of the day, what we've seen, a 56% in Ohio, percentage-wise, in terms of making sure that abortion is enshrined in their constitution, it shows that voters, at the end of the day, care even more about something else over the economy. How do you read these two signals we're getting?
You know, it's a little bit hard to say because this was a local election. When it comes to the general election, that's where you see a little bit more of what inflation and household budgets and home prices is actually doing to American households. Right now, it seems like the fight for democracy line that Biden used in 2018 during midterms that kind of blocked the Republican wave, according to a lot of analysts, that same pattern has come forth again. But also you have to look at the polling industry a little bit, how questions are asked. There's a lot of sort of like questions that are going around from analysis, an analyst questioning how questions are asked in polls. But the other thing to consider is that the economy is starting to show some more cracks. And people are going to point to the sitting president, the leaders that we have right now, and point to them rather than Donald Trump, who a couple of years ago, everyone's forgotten what happened.
And so I'm deeply curious to see what form this debate takes tonight. Will it be about the economy, stupid, or will they actually get into some of these issues? I wonder how Nikki Haley, for instance, manages the issue of abortion, not to mention foreign policy, to try to differentiate herself from others on the stage.
They're all going to have to be asked about abortion because clearly Republican messaging is not working. We've now seen this. We saw it on display last night. But remember when we sat down with Nikki Haley, she would not answer what her cutoff point is. Right. So Glenn Youngkin's talking about 15 weeks.
Yes, exactly.
We know Ron DeSantis.
And she's talking about consensus, which is not going to get applause on that stage.
She's talking about consensus, and she will not name a number.
So, interesting, Soleil, you spoke with Chris Sununu, the Republican governor of New Hampshire, about the debate coming up tonight. Here's what he had to say.
What you're likely going to see is DeSantis keep hitting Nikki Haley on a variety of things. Nikki has to show that and she did it in the second debate, I think, very well, that she isn't just kind of that flash of fire, that she really has that grit, that staying power. She can give it as well as she can get it.
So this is being framed as a showdown between Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, a race for second. He'll be in the center of the stage tonight as the highest poll getter, but she's the one with momentum. Is this, based on what we just heard about Nikki Haley, a last stand for Ron DeSantis?
It might be. He did get some fresh momentum when Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds endorsed him just a couple of days ago. But New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, when I sat down and chatted with him for the podcast, he talked a lot about how there are great governors who are in the race. He's not quite ready to back one person, but he does talk about Nikki Haley more than any other candidate. He's talked about how he's getting closer and closer to nominating her. And we've seen more donor support going toward Nikki Haley. Bloomberg News just last week reported that Gary Cohn and some other Wall Street types in New York are hosting a fundraiser for her. So Ron DeSantis has not quite resonated there, but we shouldn't really underestimate the power that the Iowa governor and our Iowa governor, particularly Kim Reynolds, has coming up against the Iowa caucus in January.
Yeah, that was a huge win for him, getting Kim Reynolds to back him, the speech, but it was almost... We all knew it was coming, right? She sat with him at a football game. She was obviously very much in Ron DeSantis' corner. When it comes to the debate tonight, though, Nikki Haley, everyone is looking at, and it's almost as the moment is meeting her expertise. Is she going to lean into that, do you think? Will she be the one to be the voice on foreign policy that, you know, the loudest voice on that stage? I know likely her and Vivek Ramaswamy potentially will get into some of those debates.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Nikki Haley, this is the winning moment for her. It's her show. I mean, she has a lot to win from this debate. Her campaign has really tried to make her foreign policy experience a highlight of her campaign. I know that they have often brought up that she's a former UN ambassador. So this is a really great opportunity for her. But I also think that she can really distinguish herself on the issue of abortion. I was talking to an analyst, and they told me, look, if I were an anti-abortion politician, I'd be scared. And I think that Nikki Haley will be able to come off of the hills of this election night where she saw that it was a referendum on abortion access and really make the case to Republican voters, specifically suburban women, and say, look, I'm different from the other candidates on the stage on the issue of abortion. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity for her. But
she won't put a number out there for a limit.
Right.
And how is she going to win a primary with that?
Let's see if she does tonight, because I suspect she'll be pressed on that issue, having been exposed in interviews to not have an answer there. But just look no further than that Marquette University poll today in Wisconsin. She leads Joe Biden by 9 points in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup here. Everyone's watching Nikki Haley tonight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great conversation with Bloomberg's Saleha Mosin and Christian Hall. We thank you, of course, as always, for being with us at the table. Coming up, Ivanka Trump takes the stand in the civil trial against her father. We'll speak with former White House Counsel Cobb. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Ivanka Trump took the stand today in the civil trial brought against her father by New York Attorney General Letitia James, testifying in part about how she did not help to allegedly inflate the worth of Trump properties on financial statements. We go now to former White House Counsel Cobb for his take on this, one of 6 trials. Of course, the former president is facing. It's good to see you. Thank you. The New York Attorney General's office, in fact, rested its case after that testimony from Ivanka Trump. She was asked a lot about loans from Deutsche Bank for Doral in Florida. And they even showed emails in which she tried to propose lowering the required net worth for her father. Did she help her dad make his case today?
So, Joe, good to be back with you all. I don't think I think she was very inconsequential. I have to say, as the world knows, that I'm no fan of Trump's big lie or the crimes that he's been charged with and the underlying conduct or his candidacy. But I will say, as a former prosecutor, I'm not really sure why they called her. I don't think she contributed a single fact other than the fact she was 9 months pregnant when she got a call from one of the potential lenders. I don't think she contributed a single fact that it wasn't established by the documents already in evidence. So I worry that to some extent, as you know, both the New York civil case and certainly the criminal case by Alvin Bragg's office have been criticized as largely political exercises, particularly the way the Attorney General and Mr. Bragg campaigned on getting Trump. I think they may have played a little bit into his political hand today by calling Ivanka, because I don't think she added anything to the existing evidence.
Well, what about his other 2 adult children, Eric Trump, Donald Jr., and also former president himself, who had a very testy exchanges with the judge? What do you make of them?
Yeah, I apologize for interrupting there. So, Donald Trump was a terrible witness. I mean, I saw that Chris Kise, who, had an excellent reputation as a lawyer in Florida, said that Trump was the best witness he's had in 33 years. And I can just say, as a trial lawyer of longer than that I feel sorry for him because I thought that was terrible testimony. Trump made a series of errors in terms of getting much closer to the decisions and related to the financial statements than he did in his deposition. And he made some, significant concessions in that regard that I don't think helped him legally at all. As far as Eric and Don Jr., I didn't follow their testimony as closely, but I think understandably, it's not their company. I think that was the point that they made. They worked for their dad. They did what they did, but But yes, I do think that Donald Trump made some serious concessions, that his testimony enhanced the case for the prosecution, certainly irritated the judge. But I also think at the same time, trying to be an honest broker here as a trial lawyer, that this trial and the outcome of this trial is pretty much preordained. I think we all know what the result is going to be: massive fines and penalties, and some limitations on the ability of the Trump organization to do business in New York. We'll have to see how the appellate courts address that, because it's been a very unusual case procedurally, and I think the evidentiary phase, while it's gone well for the prosecution, there are some holes that are consequential.
Yeah. Ty Cobb, I have to ask you about what I read in the newspaper. You never know when you're going to see the name Ty Cobb pop up. It was in the Washington Post 2 days ago. And a story that the former president, Donald Trump, has told advisors and friends, as our viewers can see here, in recent months, he wants the Justice Department to investigate one-time officials and allies who've become critical of his time in office, including you. Has your phone been ringing?
So I quibble a little bit with the ex-attorney. One, I'm still an attorney, and two, I was never his attorney. I did represent the White House as an institution as special White House counsel, but I'm not sure what he wants to go after me for, but I'm sure that he will have a revenge-based administration if he gets elected. On the other hand, our current Constitution, to the extent it's honored, makes the mere fact that he has such a list a solid defense to anybody who's on it.
It sounds like he wants to go after you for things like you're doing right now, going on television networks, speaking your mind, trying to explain what is going on in his felony trials.
Truth is an obstacle. Truth is an obstacle to him, and I think people like Bill Barr and John Kelly and others on that list who have spoken the truth are not in his good graces.
All right, former White House counsel Ty Cobb, thank you so much for your time and insight this evening. Joe, we also have some breaking news on. Thanks to be with you, Ty. We have some breaking news. What's going on in the Minnesota Supreme Court? Yep. They dismissed the quote insurrection clause. This was to the challenge to potentially keep the former president off the ballot. Yes, exactly. You've heard a lot of talk about the 14th Amendment here. A Minnesota court dismissing Trump ballot challenge for primary, which I'm sure we'll have a lot more on the terminal. But that just happened while we were talking to Ty Cobb, and something that we should all be paying attention to. So he'll remain on that Minnesota primary ballot for the presidential election of 2024. All right, coming to the program, D.C. FinTech Week wrapped up this week. Our Kaylee Lyons was there, and she'll be with us next. Tell us what she learned on the sidelines. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Regulators are learning that there are aspects of the industry that are going to be here to stay, and I think that the industry is learning that there are aspects of regulation that are going to be quite helpful.
We don't have the regulatory framework that we need. Congress could step in and do something, but that's doubtful that that will happen before the election, in my book.
There are a couple significant bills in progress right now.
There's a sense of deja vu. Here we are in November. Last year this time, there was a big bill about market structure that was up. This year, same situation. It does lead us to ask, are we going to be here next year at the same time with maybe not having resolved these questions?
Those are some of the voices discussing crypto regulation and legislation. Speaking to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons at the D.C. FinTech Week. And Kaylee's back in studio now. Tell us more. Kaylee, what did we learn? Sounds like a lot of the same.
Well, it is kind of a lot of the same. And I actually spoke to a lot of them, asking them, are we making forward progress here? Because it seems like we've been having the same conversation repeatedly for years now. The fact remains that there is not really clear regulatory boundaries between the SEC and the CFTC because Congress hasn't really set them when it comes to crypto. They have tried, or at least financial services have tried. They passed a bill out of that committee before the August recess that would essentially delineate what the CFTC has control over and what the SEC does. The SEC, of course, under Chair Gary Gensler, has pursued a lot of enforcement actions against crypto companies. He has maintained that a lot of these tokens that are issued are securities and therefore fall under the jurisdiction of the SEC. And yet a lot of the companies have pushed back on that. And there's been a lot of court cases recently that have actually dealt a blow to the SEC in that regard. The Ripple case is one. I was speaking with the CEO of that company, Brad Garlinghouse, at the event earlier today. A judge ruled that XRP was not always a security when it was issued. So that was a loss for them. And then in the Grayscale case, this is the company that is trying to convert the Grayscale Bitcoin Investment Trust into a spot ETF. That is a product that has not been approved here in the U.S. There is a futures Bitcoin ETF, but not a spot one. A judge ruled that the SEC, in denying Grayscale's attempt to convert to a spot ETF, was arbitrary and capricious and sent it back to the SEC. So now we're waiting to see what happens next, if Grayscale is actually going to get a spot ETF to happen. And I actually spoke with the CEO, Michael Sonnenschein, at the event earlier, and this is what he told me about what the time frame was looking like.
Timelines are certainly not something that has been discussed. We are continuing to have that dialogue with the SEC, and we remain optimistic that we will, get through any final hurdles that need to be there.
So they're still talking. We still don't have a spot ETF approved, but there is a lot of optimism in the market that it is going to happen eventually. But of course, that's just one regulatory hurdle that the industry is hoping to hop over. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Well, is this wishful thinking that the SEC, that Gary Gensler, is going to feel differently about it? Or did that ruling tell us how the SEC might rule on this?
Well, Chair Gensler has maintained a remarkable degree of consistency in his opinion on crypto as a whole. He says he doesn't want to prejudge any one token, but by and large, he says that there is a lot of fraud and manipulation in the crypto markets. That has been a lot of his hesitancy toward a spot ETF in the past. We'll see if that changes in the future. But he's gotten a lot of pushback, especially from Republican lawmakers on that. They do not like Gary Gensler very much. Many of them have threatened to subpoena him for information. And that's why in that legislation I was talking about, they're trying to give a little bit more power to the CFTC. It's unclear, though, whether or not that's really going to gain traction when Congress has, a government shutdown to avoid and funding issues to deal with. It seems like stablecoin legislation that also passed out of financial services might be something that passes more easily than really trying to get this market structure situation sorted out.
So once Grayscale gets this, assuming that happens, do the BlackRocks and the Fidelities all follow?
Well, that's the question. I've asked Chairman Gensler this. Are you going to approve a bunch at once, or does someone get to be first? We don't know yet.
Fascinating. We'll keep asking. At least Kayleigh will. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons covering that for us on Balance of Power. We thank you, as always, Kayleigh. Coming up, Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia Center for Politics, sharing thoughts on yesterday's elections. This is Bloomberg.
If you look at from the midterms to last night, from California to Kansas, Ohio to Virginia, the voters said, look, the government should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. I think voters have been clear, regardless of whether they're in a so-called red or blue state, that one does not have to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree the government should not be telling a woman what to do with her body.
Vice President Kamala Harris earlier today reflecting on the results of last night's elections. Let's get right to Larry Sabato, director at UVA Center for Politics and head of Sabato's Crystal Ball, as we look back on last night's election and ahead to next year's presidential race. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So just a couple of hours away from the Republican debate, which we're all looking forward to seeing what happens this evening. But of course, last night, Larry, how are you looking at the system right now? Every single poll is showing that Biden is facing a lot of trouble. Dismal polling numbers, to be honest. Yet, Democrats did very well in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Virginia last night. Is it broken?
No, actually, there's no contradiction. And it's very interesting because polls are not elections and elections are not polls, and votes are the only things that matter. Now, what polls can do is to send up a flare that there's a problem for a candidate or something that a party has to fix. And I think that's what the recent polls have done for the White House and for President Biden. But the elections are always much more important than polls. And what's fascinating about this series of elections and the ones we had in November of 2022 for the midterm election is that they're saying the same thing. There is, in fact, a sustained pro-abortion rights bias, if you will, in the general population, and it's strong enough for people to act on. They vote on the basis of their views on abortion.
I'd like to zero in on your state of Virginia for just a moment. I actually saw a couple of folks in line yesterday, Larry, and I'm taken by your tweet. I'm guessing that the governor was taken by it as well. Now, we have to remember that there was a suggestion here, a promise that Governor Youngkin would roll through this election, turn the legislature red, and then parachute into the Republican presidential primary. You write, clearance sale. All Youngkin for President 24 merchandise. A free My Pillow comes with all purchases over $1. No returns. What does this say about his future as a Republican leader?
Well, it was tongue-in-cheek. Let me just underline that for anyone who may be offended. But what it really says is this. Had Governor Youngkin succeeded in finding a way out for Republicans on the issue of abortion, which they haven't had since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and had he been able to turn the Virginia legislature red, even by tiny numbers, I think he would have been well on his way to a possible draft in 2024 and a near certain candidacy for 2028. Well, I think they can go ahead and cancel the trips to New Hampshire and Iowa and some of the other early states. Now, 2028 is a long way off, but based on his performance last night, and votes are more important than polls, he's not going to be a credible candidate for president this time around.
But the chairman of Youngkin's political operation noted on Twitter, he said in the state President Biden carried by 10 points, Republicans came within just a few thousand votes of winning majorities in both legislative chambers. There was also some districts that Republicans won that Biden won handsomely. So did the governor at least have a good night in terms of getting his message out about conservatism in Virginia, given how close this election was?
Well, it was close in part because voter turnout is so much lower for off-year elections. That's what this is. Virginia has an election every year, and I don't blame people for getting tired and maybe occasionally not voting, although I always encourage people to vote. But this was a very small turnout. And many of the races were decided by just a couple hundred votes, 300 votes, 200 votes, 100 votes. So what matters in the end is the total. That's all that matters, not the total number of votes, the total number of seats. And the fact of the matter is Democrats now control both houses of the legislature, and the governor has only 2 years left in his 1 4-year term as governor. They can't run for re-election. And he's already a lame duck.
I want to ask you about what happened last night in Kentucky. If you can follow us there, Larry. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear taking a victory lap last night. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Just look at what we were up against. 5 super PACs. My opponent's super PAC, Mitch McConnell's super PAC, Rand Paul's super PAC, the Club for Growth, the Republican Governors Association, all running ads full of hate and division. And you know what? We beat them all at the same time.
Quite a victory lap. Yes, that was a Democrat, if you're playing along on your home game in Kentucky. Donald Trump goes on Truth Social, Larry, after to write, Daniel Cameron, his rival, lost because he could not alleviate the stench of Mitch McConnell. He went on to say a lot more than that, but I believe Donald Trump endorsed Daniel Cameron. So whose stench was it last night?
Well, I don't think it was either one of their stenches, but that was so predictable. Donald Trump was going to get the first stab in and the first chance to blame somebody else. And naturally, he's going to pick Mitch McConnell since he despises him. But look, yes, it is true. Donald Trump carried Kentucky by 26 points. But you know what's refreshing about the Kentucky vote, regardless of your party? It's that finally we found a place where someone who is a good candidate with an empathetic personality and who's done a good job can get elected, even though a sizable majority of the electorate really leans or belongs to the other party. And that's what happened with Bashir's election. And he's put himself on a list, long list, for president or vice president in 2028 on the Democratic side.
How about that?
Yeah, I'm sure he is. Larry, can you just give us a sense of what you're expecting this evening when it comes to abortion on the Republican debate stage? Because clearly, last night, voters are not over, as you say, they are not over this abortion issue, and the Republican messaging is not working.
It certainly isn't, and they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They really can't abandon their long-held position on abortion. They would lose a big part of the Republican base, and they'd never win the nomination. At the same time, anything they say on television in this debate will be replayed in ad after ad after ad if one of them actually becomes the nominee. So they can't win. They might as well go ahead and appeal to the Republican base because that's who they have to please first. So I would expect there to be some tough statements made about abortion. Haley has the ability to be empathetic in a way that I don't think any of the other candidates on the stage do. That's worked for her in some other capacities so far in this election. She's way behind, but she's doing better than the other also-rans. So I'm looking to see how she handles that and how she transforms her empathy into a statement on abortion.
Yeah, a lot of people watching Nikki Haley tonight. Larry Sabato, we thank you, as always, for the insights and allowing us to peer into your crystal ball. Don't be a stranger. Coming up, the giant pandas have left the Smithsonian National Zoo here in Washington, heading back to China. We'll dive into the politics around it with our panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
There's a lot of toing and froing to tee it up so that the meeting can take place and be productive. But I think that this is a very deep contradiction between the two countries, and you need a meeting to head in the right direction, but you do not expect a meeting to make everything sweetness and light again. It's not possible.
That was Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite with the Prime Minister of Singapore earlier today talking about President Biden's expected meeting with China's President Xi. That's next week. That meeting coming as the era of panda diplomacy between the U.S. and China comes to an end. Yeah, the three giant pandas that were at the National Zoo here in D.C. taking off, departing back to China. For more, we assemble our political panel. Some serious symbolism here. Lisa Camusa-Miller, former RNC communications director, with us, the host of the Friday Reporter podcast. We're big fans. And Kevin Walling, Democratic strategist at HG Creative Media. Great to see you both here. Kevin, this is the ultimate symbolism, right, of our relationship with China. Never mind recalling the ambassador, they recalled the pandas.
And it goes back to your point, 50 years. I mean, it was Pat Nixon
That's right.
that welcomed those first pandas from China based on that historic visit from President Nixon over there. It was a sad day. I live up in Cleveland Park, not far from the zoo. Drove past it today, and it was almost like kind of a melancholy. There was a lot of reporters still out there reporting for their evening hits. And it was kind of a sad day to lose that neighbor. But to your point, it also has some ramifications based on international relations. I'm sure it'll come up next week at that summit between President Biden and President Xi. And now we only have one set of pandas in Atlanta, and they're set to leave, I think, just next year.
Wow.
Right. This is the ultimate soft power, or soft power diplomacy.
Yeah.
I think potentially everyone's focused on this, but we have a Bloomberg scoop that President Biden was briefed on what his advisors see as a Chinese plan to build a military base in Oman. Isn't those the kind of stories the president is going to bring to Xi Jinping next week when he sits down with him? These kind of issues, these power struggles around the world.
Of course. I mean, this is what makes everybody feel good about the relationship between the U.S. and China. But there's so many layers of other things that make people feel really uncomfortable about the way that this is coming together. So absolutely, the president's going to talk about real issues and not necessarily about the loss of our friends, the pandas.
These meetings have really seemed to follow a, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of pattern here. He sits down, then calls him a dictator at a fundraiser 2 nights later. How disciplined will the administration be around this meeting?
Well, I certainly think they'll be disciplined. And to your point, Joe, the administration has laid the groundwork. You both reported extensively on Janet Yellen's trip over there, Gina Romano's trip over there earlier in the year. So that certainly follows in line. I think it's an important conversation to be having. It's on U.S. Soil, which is also important. Xi Jinping is going to be meeting with other CEOs while he's here. So hopefully, this is a guy who actually had some formative years spent in Iowa, going back in his biography. So hopefully we'll be able to rekindle a little bit of his love of America that he had at one point that is certainly on the rocks.
Yeah, certainly. It's going to be an interesting time, and I'll be there, so I'll be able to witness it up close and personal. But it's not just the president and Xi Jinping. I think the CEOs is going to be an interesting take, given what's going on in the export controls space. Coming up, we will take a look at the wins in state races and how they are boosting Democrats and Biden's optimism for 2024. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. There was a string of wins for Democrats in elections around the United States last night. Let's dive into what the state races might signal, though, for 2024. Joining us now is our political panel, Lisa Camusa-Miller, former RNC Communications Director and the host of the Friday Reporter podcast, which I should say I'm on this week, and Kevin Walling, Democratic strategist at HG Creative Media. We just have to get that out of the way, right?
I knew I liked that podcast.
Full disclosure.
Yes,
and
Joe
has been on it
That's
as well.
irrelevant. You're on this week.
Yeah, I am. I'm excited. I'm a little nervous. So we have these elections last night, especially for Glenn Youngkin. He set the bar very high, saying he wanted to flip Virginia red. But Chris Christie is blaming it on the former president as to why it went so bad last night. He called it the Trump effect on why Democrats won in Kentucky, in Ohio, and in Virginia. Take a listen.
Daniel Cameron was a rising star in the Republican Party until he decided to throw his lot in with Donald Trump. I mean, let's face it, Donald Trump is political and electoral poison down ballot.
Lisa, what do you think? Is this Trump poison pill, or is there other issues at play here?
Oh, I think it's a combination of so much. I mean, yes, I love the former governor. I love what he says about Trump, and I do think he's right. I mean, there's a long list of candidates, including just last week when we were working on a speakership, or 2 weeks ago. Sorry, it's all blending together.
Feels like 2 years.
Trump keeps picking he's picking winners and losers, and he's losing. And so, yes, I think that that's a piece of what Chris Christie is saying. But there is so much rhetoric and so much conversation around issues that Republicans are going to lose on every single time. Abortion is a loser of an issue for Republicans. I don't understand how we didn't see this in the midterms, and here we go on an off year, and we've got the same exact result. I mean, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again. So I think that I would hope that we have learned our lesson and that we will turn back to the importance of strong energy policy, the economy, and other issues that the American people really do care about, because this one is not going to be a winner for them.
Well, just in case you were wondering, Donald Trump says you're all wrong. It was actually Mitch McConnell's fault. Daniel Cameron, he writes on Truth, lost because he couldn't alleviate the stench of Mitch McConnell. Tate Reeves, on the other hand, who did win in Mississippi, I haven't talked about that race yet, surged to a win for governor after my involvement. Look, there's a lot to take from this, obviously, but I wonder what the Democrats are taking as a message. Maybe we shouldn't be so worried about those polls about Joe Biden being too old, because we've got an issue here that rolled through the midterms, rolled through 2 different off-cycle elections, and will loom large in the presidential campaign.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in terms of how you frame that. Listen, abortion has been a winner for Democrats in 6 elections. Ohio made it number 7 last night. Candidates campaigning on that issue found a lot of success, not just in Virginia, but we saw it play out with expanded Democratic majorities in our home state, Lisa, and mine's in New Jersey. We saw a key judicial statewide race, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania last night as well. That's an important pickup heading into an election year for that state Supreme Court. So clearly this is a winning issue, and Republicans just don't fundamentally know how to talk about it, whether it be on the federal level. You know, Lindsey Graham kind of tiptoed into that water not too long ago with conversations of a federal ban. Obviously, Governor Youngkin, in the lead up to last night, talked about that 15-week ban, but clearly that's not resonating with the key blocks of voters that need to turn out.
One thing Youngkin did do, and it clearly didn't work overall was he didn't talk about it as a ban. He kept trying to say it's a limit. So trying to use different words around abortion. And then you have the White House that's coming out and saying Americans went out to protect their freedom. They're associating abortion rights with individual freedom. So you're close to the White House, the administration. They're obviously elated about this election, but it doesn't change the fact that poll after poll is giving Biden dismal remarks, but also it's not going to change his age, which is what most Americans are concerned with.
No, it's fundamentally true. I think, the question will be, I think, for both sides, and Donald Trump is the likely Republican nominee, is this a referendum on Joe Biden or Donald Trump? And the policies of, the MAGA extremism that, the White House wants to campaign on, or the economic situation under Joe Biden. And I think Virginia, Kentucky, proves the point that it's still that kind of extremist mentality out there that will hopefully power Democrats into 2024, but the age issue is certainly a concern. We see it come up all the time in polling. I'm hoping for, maybe a trip or fall for Donald Trump, too, so that we can take some of that focus away from Joe Biden, because, again, it's an issue of optics, certainly.
Let's roll this into the debate that begins a little more than 2 hours from now. Lisa, how big will this issue be on the debate stage tonight? I'm assuming it'll be up to the moderators to make that an issue. And how important will it be for Nikki Haley to show more nuance than the men on the stage?
Well, there's no question that she has to do that. The one other point I'd like to make to Kevin's point is that Joe Biden was not at the top of the ticket yesterday, and Donald Trump was not at the top of the ticket yesterday. So fundamentally, people feel either good or not good about how things are going in their state. But next year, they're going to be voting on what's happening in the country. Everyone feels pretty good about who their congressperson is, but Congress's overall approval rating is lower than probably what we could count on one hand. So, yes, the candidates tonight, while none of them are the front runner, which basically makes this a forum of conversation and not necessarily presidential debate, until someone actually exceeds the percentage and gets closer to the front runner at this point, they will have to outline how they will govern and how they will lead in a White House. And they need to they need to address the issue and they need to move on, but they need to talk about freedoms for people in general, because I think to Anne Marie's point, that is precisely what that was on the ballot yesterday.
Well, the White House is framing it like that. But so for someone like Governor DeSantis, when you see what happened last night to Glenn Youngkin on a 15-week limit, he signed a 6-week abortion ban. Nationally, that's not going to work. Nikki Haley has made that point. But I'd like to bring up what this means for the former president. He's trying to moderate his stance on abortion now. And he's saying we shouldn't be talking about it. Our messaging is all wrong. At the same time, quote, I did something that nobody thought was possible. I got rid of Roe v. Wade. He constantly takes credit for killing Roe v. Wade, but it put Republicans in this predicament to begin with. What's his answer going to be if he does become the nominee?
Oh, nobody squirms more than the former president on issues, and I mean that sincerely. I mean, if you are going to blame him, he's obviously going to tell you why it's someone else's fault. So he moves all around, and he's going to continue to do that. So, and nobody can really nail him down on any of the issues.
Isn't this a night that these individuals, 5 on the stage, could blame him?
Absolutely, they will. And I think I can think of 2 of the 5 that will definitely do that.
All right, so the narrative going into this debate tonight is this is a showdown between Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley. It's the race for second. Ron DeSantis will be at the center of the stage. What is the strategy for Nikki Haley to knock him out tonight? Is it policy, or does she go after character and high heels?
I think she goes after character and high heels. I think she did an incredible job taking out Vivek Ramaswamy in that first debate, totally undercutting him. She took the fight to Ron DeSantis on the China issue, for example, the fracking issue. It's amazing to me as a Democrat just to see history repeat itself. This is the same dynamic in 2016 that you have, including what you're seeing on TV, right? More ad dollars are being spent by either the hard side or the super PACs for both of those candidates attacking one another, specifically on China, than actually attacking the number one far and away leader of the pack, which is Donald Trump. But I think Nikki Haley will certainly shine, as she has in the first 2 debates on that debate stage tonight. And she's going to be far closer to the center. I mean, I don't know the podium placement, but she's either 1 or 2 with Ron DeSantis right there. That's going to set up for an interesting dichotomy as well.
One quick answer. We know who the 2 frontrunners are going to be. After this debate, who do you think leaves the stage?
Tim Scott, most likely. He barely made it to this third debate based on the qualifying thing. So
absolutely,
that's my
Tim
guess.
Scott. And the winner tonight will be the one who can differentiate themselves not from Donald Trump, but from Joe Biden, because that's what they need to do. They need to be talking about what they can do to succeed as president.
How many
and
times
stop
we hear
talking
the
about
name
Trump.
Joe Biden
That's right.
tonight? It's a
Be
great
better.
point and a great conversation. Many thanks to Kevin Walling and Lisa Camuso-Miller. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.